Good afternoon. I'm Hugh Dyer, Director in RSK's Geosciences business. Welcome to the December edition of our 2025 series of Down to Earth webinars. These will cover a broad range of subjects and are available afterwards on our YouTube channel alongside previous talks. This month, as a Christmas treat, I'll be presenting and I'll outline the process and benefits of geoenvironmental assessment at the early stages of the project. But firstly, a quick note on housekeeping. All attendees' microphones are automatically muted throughout the webinar. During the presentation, you can post questions online and there'll be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. I'll answer as many questions as possible at the end of the talk. Those that can't be answered due to time constraints will be answered after the webinar. Shortly after the webinar, you'll receive a link to a short survey. If you can take a few minutes to provide feedback, please, so we can improve on future webinars. Now, please let me introduce myself. I'm a geologist by background and I have over 23 years of experience in assessment of land for development. I'm a chartered geologist with the Geological Society and have extensive practical experience of site investigation and land assessment, and have been involved with residential and commercial development of greenfield and brownfield land. I'll now turn off my camera and continue with the presentation. So welcome today. Let me get myself organized. So how do we get from land to development? So as a start, I thought it'd be quite useful to look at the process of how we get from a piece of land to undertaking the development. So initially, we're looking at either land disposal or acquisition. This is where a landowner is either trying to dispose of a piece of land, sell it on, or quite often our clients are looking to purchase land with a view to develop the land or take it into then other use. So at this stage, when we're looking at the land disposal and acquisition, quite often we're looking at surveys where we're looking at a very high level understanding of the piece of land. So it's looking at those key high level details. Actually, is there any major issues on the piece of land? Understanding the context, the surroundings for the land, to give that initial advice to understand what are the potential opportunities or constraints associated with that piece of land. From there, we're then going to a viability stage where our clients, the developers, are now looking at, actually, does this stack up? So we know this is a piece of land that hasn't got any major issues, but actually having a bit more of an in-depth understanding of the context of the site, the historical uses of the site. So those outline surveys, high-level desk study to understand more about the site in order then to look at it in a financial viability, or in terms of their development, is the time frame going to fit with their development time frames. Once we understand more about the viability of the piece of land, there's two routes that we can then look at. So traditionally they're either outline planning or detailed planning. So for detailed planning, this is where we might have a very straightforward, might be a small piece of land, or might be a direct going straight for construction. Whereas quite often the more traditional route is going through outline planning. So this is then setting the scene and understanding, okay, what are we going to develop? What's it generally going to look at? What's the development going to look like? and then undertaking those planning surveys. So that includes then a more detailed desk study, and it might also involve some initial site investigation to target some of those key areas that we've identified previously or as part of those outline planning surveys. Once we get into detailed planning, this is where now we know the site's going to go forward, we have a plan for what the development's going to be, and we're filling in more and more details on this. So there we're looking at site investigation works, potentially mitigation design, if we've found particular things on site that we need to manage. And then through that outlining and detailed planning stage, through the planning application system, we'll then have a series of conditions to that planning, and we go into a process of discharging those conditions. So then either undertaking further site investigation, undertaking remediation and validation of that remediation, then to tick off some of these conditions. And in line with that, we're also then looking at pre-construction. So we're now taking the information that we've learned from all the previous stages, and we might be looking at materials management plans, design, undertaking and validating earthworks, and then that takes us then into the construction stage, where we're looking then at garden validations, silt management, assisting the construction, so assisting the contractors and developers in delivering that development. So that's a very brief summary of how we get from a piece of land to a final development. So then why are we doing this? Through that initial screening assessment, when we're looking at the high-level viability and looking at the disposal and acquisition of land, as I say, we're looking for those significant constraints. So things that might actually just render that piece of land unworkable in the current development conditions, might be unusable for that particular scenario. So if we're looking for big logistics sheds, actually then sites that have some major constraints, such as instability of land, or make it unsuitable for those large constructions, whereas it might be suitable for different uses. And then looking at the high-level desk study, we're then pulling together the available information from a desk-based only scenario to try and put more of a picture together about the piece of land and have a better understanding then of the potential constraints. It's important at this stage to look at a walkover survey, so to bring that high-level desk study information into the real world, to start looking at things that we've noted in our desk study and see how they relate to the actual site, and look at potential access issues and so on. And then we go into the detailed desk study. So this is then pulling more information together, obtaining environmental reports to further investigate those potential constraints and risks. This stage, we might then look at initial intrusive investigations. So that might be if we flagged that there's major potential issues on site, then we might go in and target those with some trial pits and boreholes to give us a better understanding, actually at this stage, whether it's viable and whether we can progress on to the next stage. And then, as I say, detailed site investigation. So again, it's filling in those gaps, starting to build up the picture of that site. So we've got better understanding and we can have a better view of the constraints and potential costs as we go through the development process. So if we first look at our desk study researchers, So from a desk study point of view, what do we need to know? So quite importantly is the historical setting. So obviously we might walk up to a piece of land and it looks like a nice green empty field, but do we understand actually what's happened previously on that site? It might be that the land use now is fairly benign, so it could be a retail park, so on. But again, understanding what the land has been used for historically and filling in more of that information. And so getting a picture of those previous site uses, understanding what the implications are of those previous site uses, and also the surrounding site uses. So understanding the current setting of the site and how those might impact in terms of contamination or land stability or other constraints in terms of air quality and noise as well. And of course, being a geologist, my focus is quite often on the ground conditions. So a thorough understanding of the setting of the site in terms of what's beneath the site, again, what the implications are from the historical use of the site, but also the geological setting of the site. But also understanding what is the proposed development, because as I say, it would be a very different process for, say, a big logistics warehouse, as it would be for residential properties, as it would be for, say, school or other hospitals and so on. So in terms of guidance, there's many guidance documents and approaches to undertaking land assessment. However, the Land Contamination Risk Management published by the Environment Agency provides a good basis for both contaminated and uncontaminated land. It provides basic standards for our desk study and site investigation, and it's a good process to follow that regime. Outlines a desk study checklist. So again, this is the basic information that you would look for in your desk study, but then that is just the basic checklist. And then there's obviously, we might well go into more depth than is outlined in the LCRM. It also gives you a scope for the site walkover to make sure you're picking up on those aspects that are important to the assessment of that land. And then if we now look at our desk study, one of the first places that we look at is our historical mapping. So again, it's understanding this history of the site and the setting of the site. So for a brief example, I've just chosen this site just to give us some context of what things we're looking at when we're looking at historical mapping for a site. So here we have the 1885 mapping, and the key features on this mapping, we have a gas works down in the south of the image here. And here with gas works, we're looking at historical processes of extracting gas from coal. So this process of extracting gas from coal gave lots of byproducts such as oils and tar and other chemicals, which obviously then can impact on that land and on that setting. Here we have a clay pit. So although you may think, well, that's just a bit of a hole in the ground, these are often associated with brickworks, which are then associated with ashy materials and so on from making the bricks. And it also raises questions over the backfill of that clay pit. And also associated with the brickworks, there's gas and contamination, as well as ground instability from that backfill material. We also have here quite a few buildings marked as works. So this is quite a generic term for lots of different factories and warehouses, which could be of many different origins. So this could be possibly metalworks or storage. And again, it's where we need to start looking more in depth to understand those historical uses. So looking at the 1902 mapping here, we still have this gasworks down the south, but we can now see this is quite extended with further gas holders and buildings, as well as rail links. So as the gas works expanded, we're now looking at producing coal-derived chemicals. So this could include creosote, ammonia, sulfuric acid. So all these provide a bit more information in terms of what we might be expecting if we need to investigate these areas. This is also linked to the rail sidings. And so these rail sidings up in the west of the area here. This is storage and movement of freight, obviously, but there's potential then for fuel storage and use, shunters going back and forwards, and oils and lubricants from those activities, as well as what's stored in those freight yards. Could there be leakages of chemicals and different associated products? And then moving on to the 1938 mapping. So here, there could be a chemical works that's associated with that gas works. And so there's potential for storage and leakage, and also other disposal of byproducts from the chemical works. So again, it's further unpicking what might be in the ground, what might be we're looking for when we start to further investigate these sites. Over here, we've got a sawmill or timber works. So you might think that's fairly benign. You just bring trees in, chop them up, and then send them back out as planks of wood. But actually, there's preservatives and chemicals associated with that. There could be paints, and there's oils and fuels from the machinery and from obviously the logistics, the lorries coming in and taking things back out again. And then if we move on to the 1989 mapping, here we've got a cattle market. So you might again think, oh, that's just animals coming in and going out. But actually, is there an abattoir associated with that? Could there be pathogens from the animals that have gone through there? Is there potential for anthrax from buried carcasses? And then animal products, byproducts. And also, again, a potential for industry fuels and so on. And finally, we've got identified a mill here. So again, that raises questions, because is this a timber mill? Is this a cotton mill? Is this other industrial mill activities? So through all of this, we're starting to get a bit more of a picture then of our site and the context of our site, and what we might be looking for when we get to the investigation stages. But with historical mapping and review of these images, it gives us a snapshot of what was mapped on those dates. But are we getting the full picture? So in this example, here's a historical map from 1994. On this historical mapping, we can see there's a sand pit, which is labelled in the centre of the image there. Got sports grounds and allotment gardens. And so obviously in there, and the small works there. So obviously in there, the main interest is this sand pit. When we move on to the 2001 mapping, here we haven't got the sand pit shown on this mapping. We've still got the recreation grounds, allotment gardens. So again, that brings up a bit of a query in our mind as to what's happened to that sand pit. When we look at the 2010 mapping, we've now got development across this area where we did have the sandpit. So we had the sandpit, which was shown on the western end of where that development is shown, but there's nothing to indicate there was anything on the eastern end of that new development. If we now look at the historical aerial imagery, which is available online from online sources, in 1945, we see that it's open fields, so agricultural land uses. There's a small area of quarry up in the centre west. And then when we move on to the 2002 aerial imagery, we can see actually that sandpit that on the historical mapping was shown almost exclusively in the centre and west of our site area actually extends much further over to the east. So this is information that wasn't shown on the historical mapping that we can actually pick up from the available aerial imagery. When we look in 2003, we can now see that that sand pit actually is far more extensive, and we can see the start of backfilling and development further north in the sand pit, but actually extends all the way across to the south of that recreation ground and allotment gardens. And then looking at the 2009 mapping, we can now see that residential development has been brought across that whole area. But that raises questions in terms of what was that backfill that's underneath that residential development area. How was it backfilled? What was it backfilled with? What are the materials there? Is there a risk of instability? Is there a risk of gas from that backfill? We would hope that with development in the 2000s, this has been backfilled in a engineered fashion, and actually those houses are built on solid ground. But obviously, for more historical sites where we've noted that there has been a quarry, and then there's not a quarry shown any further, then it raises questions of what that backfill was. So in reviewing those historical mapping and having more of an understanding, then what are we looking for? How can these impact our site? So with previous buildings that might be on site, we've got the buried foundations. We could have basements in there. Have they been backfilled with crushed demolition rubble? Actually, are there voids? What's the implications then for site investigation if we go into those areas? Are there remnant cables? Have those been actually cut off from the mains and the pipes as well? In terms of our next step in investigating this site, how can we make sure that our staff and our site investigation contractors are safe? And how can we tailor our investigation to answer some of these questions? With factories, as we covered, has there been chemical storage? Understanding, have we got plans of the factory from when it was active, showing where different chemical storage was, where different machine bases were? Actually, did they have heavy equipment in there? So we're suddenly going to have much bigger foundation and machine pits. That have these been grubbed out? Have they been dealt with in a suitable manner? Actually, is there potential for oils and lubricants in the bottom of those machine pits? Looking at farms, we might think, well, actually, that's just big open pieces of land. But in terms of the farm compounds, the working areas, where did they store their fuel? Where did they store their chemicals for use on the site? Fertilizers, pesticides, how were they used and stored? Have they been used extensively across those fields? And then also, is there potential for buried livestock or other materials on site? And a lot of the farming buildings and agricultural buildings were constructed with asbestos. If those have been replaced or if they've been damaged, actually, where is that asbestos gone? Is it that it's stored on site, under the site? Is there a potential that that's actually been ploughed through some of these fields? And again, understanding potentially from the farmer, have they installed unrecorded pipe work? So water pipes that go out to their feeding troughs, cables for any external sheds and so on. Actually, are there gas pipes that lead from the main building out to some of their sheds? So it's trying to piece all this information together in order then to inform not only the end development, but actually in our next steps in investigating the site. So looking at metalworks, on these sites they use solvents and cleaners as well as oils and lubricants to obviously lubricate the machinery and oils for the machinery, but also to clean the metals. And then there's potential for heavy metals. How have they cleaned those products in order then to do their metalworking? Well, we've already talked about timber works, potential for creosotes and preservatives, fuels, and again, machine bases. Some of these timber works have got pretty big machines for the preservatives and also for the obviously cutting up the trees. And then also understanding about collieries and gas works. Actually, are we anticipating shafts and shallow mining on site? Is there potential for heavy oils and heavy metals? And then again, our old friend asbestos. Where could that be across the site? And is that buried or incorporated into the main ground? Moving on from that, we look at the ground conditions. So this is the geological setting. I've just put up quite an interesting geological plan here of an area in the West Midlands. But it's understanding the whole context of the ground conditions then. So bedrock, do we understand the composition and thickness and also the depth to this bedrock? What are the implications for our foundations, say from shallow, hard dig materials or from weak bedrock that actually might need to extend foundations? In terms of superficial soils, so these are the glacial and river deposits. Understanding, are these permeable or impermeable? How does this impact on our soakaways, or would it provide a barrier to contamination from the site? Faulting across the site, so these are these nice dotted lines over here. This gives an implication for broken ground and potential pathways. So even if we've got relatively impermeable bedrock, actually, if it's quite faulted, is there a pathway down to the deeper ground then? But also instability and differing depths to the bedrock. So it's really important to understand the different types of bedrock that we might encounter beneath the site. In terms of mineral seams, so these could be halite or salt that's below the ground, limestone in the Midlands, and which could be associated with steel and cement works, and of course coal seams beneath the ground. So understanding that, yes, they're marked as a nice dotted line across your map, but actually understanding which way they extend below your, are they extending below your site or away from your site? We also need to visualize this in 3D, not just looking at a map without crops on it. So understanding that actually these could be relatively thin layers, and what is beneath that layer and what are the implications for the site. And also in this illustration here, we can see that there's an upthrust block in the middle where we've got faults either side. So then understanding we've got fault zones and that this pink layer here has been thrust up in the middle. So what are the implications if our site is across these two and our foundations are in different bedrock across the site? As I say, it's really important to undertake a site walkover to put the site in context and to have some observations of how our desk-based assessment actually relates to the physical site. So here we could be relating historical features. Are they still there? Have they actually been removed? Understanding actually some of those historical observations. Has there been a factory that might be off-site? Has that been redeveloped recently? And so then understanding, well, that could be that whole site has been remediated now and the risk is much less. And then identifying potential constraints either to our site investigation or to the future development. So here we have a marker post. Once you start seeing these around, you notice them everywhere. So they're marking gas or oil pipelines or other features that could extend across the site. So understanding how can we access the site. Actually, are there gates that we can get through to go and do our site investigation? What are the limitations getting around the site? And then also what the ground conditions getting around the site. Understanding, I spoke previously about talking to landowners, talking to farmers, to actually understand their knowledge of the site. What context can they give us that will help us either through the designing of our development or through the site investigation stage. And then understanding our surrounding areas. Actually, as I've said, was a potentially contaminated site next door, which has now been redeveloped. So we can assume then it has been redeveloped and remediated. As I say, all this then feeds into how can this impact our development. So here I've got just a very illustrative master plan of a site just born out of AI. But this gives us then a constraints plan, understanding what can we give to our developer clients so they can understand how best to design their development. Has it got implications for the drainage design? So we talked about soakaways. Are there areas of the site which are more likely to be suitable for soakaways and areas where actually the ground's fairly impermeable? Potential mitigation. So assessment of our source pathway receptor, understanding actually is there a potential for contamination of receptors both on site and also off site. And then that will lead into then land remediation. What are the requirements? I'll put mineral planning considerations in there because obviously lots of sites are underlain by potential mineral. This could be sands and gravels or clay. And then it's considering, is there potential for prior extraction of that sand and gravel and clay? Will that then impact on the development that comes in the future? Or actually is there potential for incidental abstraction? So from our foundation trenches, from other excavations on site, can we potentially win mineral from that we can use on site or off site? And so that identifies them opportunities and constraints in terms of our mineral planning. But then understanding, is there engineering materials on site that can help with earthworks? So having a good understanding of what's underlying the site to understand, is there actually sand and gravel that can be used for land raising elsewhere on site? could these materials, if excess, be used elsewhere on other sites through a materials management plan? And then all this feeds into a more thorough understanding of the abnormal costs for the development. So going back to our viability, understanding where those abnormal costs might come in and how we might mitigate some of those. So having the desk study, having that broad understanding, then gives us an insight into, are there areas which would benefit from initial investigation? So from our initial desk study, our initial high-level assessment, are there areas where we want to target going through planning, going through viability stage to understand, do we need to target the different geological outcrops to understand the permeability of the ground, inform the drainage design? Are we looking either side of fault areas to understand where those ground conditions are? And to give a general spread across the site at that initial investigation stage. But then this helps us then to identify constraints on the site and to try and give us more information to inform decisions going through that development process. It also might target some of those primary contaminant sources. So if we've got a fuel station next to the site, actually targeting that and putting some boreholes close to that to understand what is the potential risk from that off-site source, or if there are on-site potential sources of contamination, targeting those. And as I say, I've spoken about soakaway potential, identifying whether there's better areas on site for soakaways, so we can inform the other disciplines in terms of drainage and so forth. And then once we get into that detailed planning stage and that pre-construction, it's filling in that grid of our investigation then to give us an appropriate grid of positions, but also to review those initial findings and target our investigation so we get the best out of our investigation. But this will probably be based on our development layout, so a broader grid in areas of open space, and then closing that grid in around our construction development areas. But then this also supports on the design stage, so understanding from the structural and civil engineers and others, actually, is there things that they want us to target? Is there a particular investigation that they need so they can inform their design? And as I said at the outset, addressing those planning conditions. So making sure that we speak to the EHO at the planning authority to understand what information they want in order then to put a nice big tick in that box to say, yes, we are happy that there is no risk to this development or no risk to the environment. So as a summary of this very quick canter through geoenvironmental assessment of sites, it's really understanding at that very early stage, what are we trying to achieve? Understanding what are our objectives through this process so that we understand what the ultimate goal is, and we can then plot out a path through the investigation or the assessment of that site. What are the requirements from our client, from their engineers, from other people involved in the development, so that we can make sure that we're providing the information at those key stages as we go through the planning and development process. And it all comes back to that, understanding the site context and setting. So having a thorough and deep understanding of the site's ground conditions, historical setting, the surrounding uses. So then we can identify those key constraints, actually understanding at an early stage, what are the key drivers through this that we need to inform our clients. And as always, it's a very, very delicate balance between cost versus value. actually at what stage do we need to spend money in order to inform the decisions in order to give best value to our clients as we go through this process. So thank you very much for bearing with me with this very quick canter through this subject, and I shall now have a look through and see if we've got any questions that have popped up. Right, I must have absolutely blitzed that subject, because looking on, I can't see any questions posted. So I must say thank you ever so much for listening through. I hope it's been very informative and useful. And we're taking a break in January. So our next Down to Earth talk will be on Tuesday, the 10th of February. And we'll be looking at the challenges of investigation of fuel facilities, including fuel filling stations. So please remember to complete the feedback following the presentation. And thank you for attending today, and we'll see you again in February.